There are moments in history when a single piece of information, whispered in the wrong ear or read by the wrong eyes, can unravel everything. When knowledge becomes both a privilege and a death sentence. When literacy, that basic human right we take for granted, transforms into the most dangerous weapon a man can possess. This is the story of a man who could read when he wasn't supposed to. A man who became indispensable precisely because of the one skill that should have made him invisible. And how one sentence, hidden in a pile of correspondence, revealed a truth so devastating that it would seal the fate of everyone who knew it. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in ink and paper. Some letters should never be opened. And some men should never learn to read. The Charleston plantation district sprawled across the South Carolina low country like a patchwork of cotton and rice fields, each property a small kingdom unto itself. The year was 1852, and among the dozens of estates that lined the Cooper River, the Hightower plantation stood out not for its size, though it was considerable, but for its reputation as a place where everything ran with mechanical precision. Samuel Hightower had inherited the property from his father 15 years earlier, and in that time he had transformed it into one of the most profitable operations in the region. While other planters struggled with crop failures and market fluctuations, Hightower's yields remained consistently high. While others complained about labor problems and runaways, his plantation operated like clockwork. The secret, or so he told his peers at the Gentlemen's Club in Charleston, was efficiency, systems, order, and perhaps most importantly, finding the right person for the right task. Thomas was that person. He had arrived at the Hightower plantation as a child, purchased at auction in Charleston when he was barely 9 years old. The auction record listed him simply as boy, healthy, no defects. But there was something about the child that had caught Samuel Hightower's attention that day. The way the boy's eyes followed the auctioneer's written notations, the way his lips moved slightly, as if sounding out the words on the signs around the market. Most buyers wouldn't have noticed, most buyers wouldn't have cared, but Samuel Hightower had noticed, and he had cared very much. The plantation office was a modest building adjacent to the main house, filled with ledgers, correspondence, bills of sale, and the endless paperwork that accompanied running a large agricultural operation. It was here that Thomas spent most of his days, and it was here that he became what no enslaved person was supposed to become. Educated. The education hadn't happened all at once. In the beginning, Thomas had simply been assigned to clean the office, to keep the papers organized, to maintain the filing system. But Hightower had watched him, tested him, gradually revealing that he knew the boy could read. And instead of punishing this forbidden knowledge, he had cultivated it. "You understand, Thomas," Hightower had said one afternoon when Thomas was 12, "that what you can do is illegal in this state. If anyone knew, you could be sold south or worse. But I have a use for you, a particular use. And if you serve me well in this capacity, you'll find your life here far more comfortable than most." It was a bargain struck, not between equals, but between a man with absolute power and a boy with no choice. Thomas would become Hightower's private secretary of sorts, the only enslaved person on the plantation who could read and write, the only one who could be trusted with the master's correspondence. The benefits were real. Thomas lived not in the quarters with the field hands, but in a small room attached to the office building. He ate better, dressed better, and was exempt from the brutal labor in the fields. He was never whipped, never sold, never loaned out to other planters. In the hierarchy of plantation life, he occupied a strange middle space, not free, but not quite as enslaved as the others. The cost was isolation. The field hands viewed him with suspicion, seeing him as the master's spy. The house servants treated him with careful distance, aware that he moved in spheres they didn't understand. Even the overseer, a hard-faced man named Garrett, seemed uncertain how to categorize Thomas. He was property, yes, but property with access to information that even Garrett wasn't privy to. And Thomas had access to everything. Every morning he would sort through the mail that arrived from Charleston, letters from business associates in Boston and New York, correspondence from cotton brokers in Liverpool and Manchester, personal notes from Hightower's sister in Richmond, from his uncle in Mobile, from a dozen distant relatives and social acquaintances scattered across the South. His job was to read everything first, to categorize the letters by importance, to prepare summaries of lengthy business correspondence, and to handle responses to routine matters. Hightower would review his work each evening, make corrections, provide guidance, and then Thomas would prepare the final versions for mailing. It was a system that worked perfectly. Hightower could manage his extensive business interests without drowning in paperwork. Thomas, for his part, performed his duties with meticulous care, never giving his master reason to doubt the arrangement. But of course, Thomas read everything, every private letter, every business deal, every family secret that passed through Hightower's correspondence. He knew about the debts Hightower owed to banks in Charleston. He knew about the land speculation deals that had gone sour in Georgia. He knew about the ongoing feud with Hightower's brother-in-law over their father's will. He knew which of the neighboring planters were on the verge of bankruptcy, which ones were selling off their enslaved workers to cover losses. Knowledge accumulated over years, a vast mental library of information that Thomas could never share, never act upon, never use for anything except serving his master more efficiently, until the letter arrived in September. It came in the regular post from Charleston, mixed in with a dozen other pieces of correspondence. The envelope was unremarkable. Good quality paper, a Charleston postmark, addressed in a neat, feminine hand. Thomas opened it, as he opened everything else, preparing to read and categorize. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Hayes, and it began innocuously enough. She wrote that she had been referred to Mr. Hightower by a mutual acquaintance in Charleston. She understood he was a gentleman of means and discretion. She had a matter to discuss that required both qualities. Thomas's eyes moved down the page, his expression neutral, professional. He had read hundreds of such letters. People were always approaching Hightower with business propositions, investment opportunities, requests for loans or partnerships. But then came the sentence that changed everything. I am writing to inform you that your son, born to me 17 years ago and given the name Jonathan Hayes, is now of an age where his paternity should be acknowledged, at least privately, and his future secured. Thomas's hand froze. He read the sentence again, then again. The letter continued, but the words seemed to blur on the page. Catherine Hayes explained that she had never sought to cause difficulty for Mr. Hightower, that she had respected his position and his marriage. She had raised the boy herself with the help of her family. But times were difficult. Her parents had both passed, and she thought it only right that Hightower should contribute to the boy's education and eventual establishment in society. She was not demanding public acknowledgement, she stressed. She understood the delicacy of the situation, but surely a man of Hightower's wealth could provide some financial support. Surely he had some feeling for the child he had fathered. The letter was polite, almost apologetic in tone. There was no threat in the words, no hint of blackmail. But the implications were devastating. Samuel Hightower had a son, a white son, born out of wedlock to a woman in Charleston. A son he had never acknowledged, never mentioned. A son who, if his existence became known, could create a scandal that would rock Charleston society and potentially destroy Hightower's marriage. Thomas set the letter down carefully on the desk. His heart was pounding, but his face remained impassive. This was information he was not supposed to have. Information that was dangerous beyond measure. In the complex social hierarchy of the antebellum South, a man's reputation was everything. Extramarital affairs were quietly tolerated among the planter class, but a child from such a liaison, especially one acknowledged however privately, created legal and social complications. There was the wife to consider, Martha Hightower, who came from one of Charleston's oldest families and had brought substantial property to the marriage. There was the question of inheritance, of legitimate versus illegitimate children. There were the whispers, the speculation, the knowing looks at social gatherings. And there was something else, something that Thomas understood with absolute clarity. He was now the only person on the plantation, perhaps the only person in the world outside of Catherine Hayes herself, who knew this secret. The question that occupied his mind for the rest of that morning was simple. What was he going to do about it? The obvious answer, the safe answer, was nothing. He would file the letter with the others marked as requiring Hightower's personal attention. He would not speak of it, not think of it, not acknowledge that he understood its significance. He would do his job exactly as he had always done it. But something held him back from filing the letter in the usual way. Perhaps it was the cumulative weight of 12 years of reading other people's secrets. Perhaps it was the strange, bitter knowledge that came from being the invisible observer of so many lives more privileged than his own. Perhaps it was simply curiosity, the very human need to know what would happen next. Whatever the reason, Thomas did something he had never done before. He made a copy of the letter. It was risky. If Hightower ever discovered that Thomas was keeping copies of correspondence, the consequences would be severe. But Thomas had become skilled over the years at handling paper, at writing quickly and neatly, and he had access to everything in the office: paper, ink, sealing wax, envelopes. He worked through the lunch hour when he knew he wouldn't be disturbed. His hand moved steadily across the page, reproducing Catherine Hayes's neat script as closely as he could. When he was finished, he had 2 letters that looked nearly identical. He placed the original in the pile for Hightower's evening review and hid the copy inside one of the old ledgers on the bottom shelf of the office bookcase. That evening, Hightower reviewed the correspondence as usual. Thomas watched from across the office, organizing papers, but his attention was focused on his master's face as those eyes moved down the page of Catherine Hayes's letter. Hightower's expression didn't change. That was the first surprise. His face remained calm, almost blank, as he read the letter once, then again. When he finally set it aside, his movements were deliberate, controlled. "Thomas," he said, his voice level. "Yes, sir. This letter from Miss Hayes. Prepare a response. Tell her that her letter has been received, that the matter will be given consideration, and that she should expect further correspondence within the month. Be polite but non-committal." "Yes, sir." "And Thomas, this letter and any response to it are to be filed separately, not with the general correspondence, do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Hightower's eyes met his for just a moment, and in that moment, Thomas saw something he had rarely seen in his master's face. Uncertainty. Not fear, exactly. Hightower was not a man who frightened easily. But there was a calculation happening behind those eyes, a weighing of options and consequences. "You understand, of course," Hightower said carefully, "that everything that passes through this office is confidential. That discretion is the cornerstone of your position here." "I understand, sir." "Good. See to that letter, then." The response was drafted, reviewed, and sent. The original letter was filed in a locked drawer of Hightower's desk, separate from all other correspondence. And life on the plantation continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Over the following weeks, Thomas watched Hightower with new attention. The master made 2 trips to Charleston that fall, which was unusual. Typically, Hightower conducted business through correspondents and trusted agents, visiting the city only a few times a year. These trips were brief, just a day or 2 each, and Hightower offered no explanation for them beyond vague references to business matters. More letters arrived from Catherine Hayes. Thomas opened and read each one before passing them along to Hightower. The tone of the letters shifted gradually from polite request to increasing concern. Miss Hayes wrote that she had expected more than just acknowledgement. She had hoped for specifics, an amount, a plan, some concrete indication that Hightower intended to fulfill his obligations. Her circumstances, she wrote, were becoming difficult. Her son was bright, deserved education, opportunities. Surely Mr. Hightower could understand a mother's concern for her child's future. Hightower's responses, which Thomas dutifully drafted under his master's guidance, remained polite but evasive. The matter was being considered. Arrangements took time. Patience was required. By November, the tone of Catherine Hayes's letters had changed again. Now there was an edge to them. a hint of desperation or perhaps frustration. She wrote that she had been patient for 17 years. She had asked for nothing during all that time, had kept her silence, had protected his reputation. She thought such loyalty deserved recognition. It was in this letter that she mentioned, almost casually, that her son Jonathan had expressed interest in traveling to visit his father's plantation. The boy was curious about the man who had given him life, even if he couldn't give him a name. Perhaps a visit could be arranged. Hightower's face when he read that letter was a study in controlled rage. He dictated a response that was notably colder than previous correspondence. Such a visit would be impossible, he wrote. Entirely inappropriate. Miss Hayes needed to understand that there were boundaries to what could be accommodated, limits to what discretion allowed. Thomas copied that letter too, adding it to his secret archive in the ledger. The response from Catherine Hayes came 2 weeks later, and it was the shortest letter yet. Just 3 sentences. I see that I have misjudged your character. I believed you to be a man of honor. Perhaps I was wrong. Hightower crumpled that letter in his fist after reading it, then smoothed it out again carefully and filed it away. He said nothing to Thomas, gave no instructions for a response. But Thomas could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. Something was going to happen. Thomas could feel it in the atmosphere of the office, in the way Hightower now seemed to view every piece of correspondence with suspicion, in the frequency of his visits to Charleston. In December, Garrett, the overseer, received orders to hire additional guards for the plantation. This was unusual. The plantation had never had more than 2 men serving in that capacity, and their duties were primarily to patrol the property at night, to watch for runaways or unauthorized visitors. Now, suddenly, there were 4 guards, and they seemed to be paying particular attention to the main road that led to the plantation entrance. Thomas heard the whispers among the house servants. There had been threats, they said. Someone had written to the master, demanding money. Thieves or criminals of some kind. That's why the guards had been hired. But Thomas knew better. He knew exactly what Hightower was afraid of. The day before Christmas, a man arrived at the plantation gate. He was young, perhaps 17 or 18, well-dressed in the manner of Charleston's middle class. He told the guards that his name was Jonathan Hayes, and he wished to speak with Mr. Hightower on a matter of personal importance. The guards, following their instructions, turned him away. They were polite but firm. Mr. Hightower was not receiving visitors. If Mr. Hayes had business to discuss, he should conduct it through proper channels, through correspondence. The young man argued. He said he had traveled from Charleston specifically for this meeting. He said it was a matter that could not be discussed in letters. He said, and Thomas heard this third hand, from one of the house servants who had heard it from one of the guards. He said that he was family. The guards escorted him off the property. He left, but not before standing at the gate for a long moment, staring up the tree-lined drive toward the main house he would never enter. Thomas learned about the incident that evening from Hightower himself. There was a situation at the gate today, Hightower said, his voice carefully neutral, a young man claiming to be related to the family. The guards handled it appropriately. I see, sir, Thomas replied. If anyone should inquire about the incident, any of the servants, anyone at all, you are to say that it was a confused young man, perhaps touched by madness or strong drink. You understand? Yes, sir. Good. But Hightower's hand shook slightly as he poured himself a glass of whiskey that evening, and Thomas noticed. The letter that arrived in January was different from all the others. It came not from Catherine Hayes, but from a law office in Charleston. Blackwell and Sons, attorneys at law. Thomas's blood ran cold as he read it. The letter was formal, written in the dry legal language of professional correspondence. It informed Mr. Hightower that the firm was now representing Miss Catherine Hayes and her son, Jonathan Hayes, in a matter concerning paternity and financial support. The letter outlined in precise legal terms the evidence Miss Hayes possessed. Letters from Hightower written years earlier. Letters Thomas had never seen from before he had come to work in the office. Testimony from witnesses who could place Hightower and Miss Hayes together during the relevant time period. and the physical resemblance between Jonathan Hayes and the Hightower family. The letter stated that Miss Hayes did not wish for public scandal. She remained willing to settle the matter privately, but she required concrete action, formal acknowledgement of paternity in a legal document, a substantial sum to cover the costs of Jonathan's upbringing and education, and provisions for Jonathan's future. If these terms were not met within 30 days, the letter concluded, Miss Hayes would be forced to pursue the matter through the courts, and the details would necessarily become a matter of public record. It was blackmail, dressed up in legal language. Polite blackmail, perhaps, but blackmail nonetheless. Thomas filed the letter as instructed and waited for Hightower's reaction that evening. There was a long silence in the office after Hightower finished reading. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the scratch of Thomas's pen as he worked on routine correspondence at the side desk. "Thomas," Hightower finally said, his voice strange, distant. "Yes, sir." "How long have you worked in this office?" The question caught Thomas off guard. 12 years, sir. Since I was 12 years old." 12 years, Hightower repeated. "And in all that time, have you ever betrayed a confidence? Ever spoken of the business that passes through this room?" "No, sir. Never." "No," Hightower agreed. "You've been perfectly loyal, perfectly discreet, which is why I find myself in an unusual position, Thomas. I need to trust you with something that goes beyond our usual arrangement." Thomas set down his pen, giving Hightower his full attention. "This matter with the Hayes woman," Hightower continued. "It's complicated, messy, the kind of thing that can destroy a man if it's not handled properly." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I need someone who can travel to Charleston on my behalf, someone who can deliver a message or perhaps retrieve something, someone who won't ask questions or speak of what they've seen or heard." "I understand, sir. Do you?" Hightower's eyes were sharp now, calculating. "Because what I'm about to ask you to do, it's outside the normal scope of your duties. It may require you to be clever, to think on your feet, and it absolutely requires your complete silence." Thomas nodded slowly. "What would you need me to do, sir?" Hightower stood and walked to the window, looking out over the dark plantation grounds. "I need you to deliver a response to the lawyers, in person, not through the mail. And I need you to make it clear, very clear, that I will not be extorted. That if Miss Hayes wishes to pursue this matter in court, she should understand that the full weight of the Hightower name and resources will be brought to bear. That such a course would be ruinous for her and her son. You want me to threaten them, sir?" "I want you to make them understand reality," Hightower corrected. "Miss Hayes has lived a comfortable life in Charleston because I have provided for her, quietly, over the years. She owns her house because I arranged the purchase. She has enjoyed a certain social position because I ensured she had the means to maintain it. If she chooses to make this matter public, all of that ends. She'll be revealed as a woman who carried on an affair with a married man who conceived a child out of wedlock. Her son will be labeled a bastard. They'll both be ruined socially, and I'll make certain they're ruined financially as well." Thomas listened carefully, his face neutral but his mind was racing. This was a side of Hightower he had never seen so directly. The cold calculation, the willingness to destroy those who threatened him. "I'll need papers," Thomas said carefully. "Travel documents explaining why I'm going to Charleston. A letter of introduction to the lawyers, perhaps, so they'll agree to meet with me. All of that will be arranged," Hightower assured him. "You'll travel under the guise of conducting routine business for the plantation. As far as anyone else knows, you're simply picking up supplies or delivering crop samples. But your real purpose will be to deliver my message to the Blackwell firm and to gauge their seriousness. If they're reasonable, there may be room for a small settlement, something that satisfies Miss Hayes without acknowledging anything publicly. If they're intransigent, well, then we move to other strategies. When would you want me to leave, sir?" "Tomorrow," Hightower said. "The response needs to be delivered before the 30-day deadline they've imposed. I'll have everything ready for you in the morning." That night, Thomas lay awake in his small room, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the secret archive of letters he had been copying and hiding in the office ledger. He thought about Catherine Hayes and her son, turned away at the plantation gate. He thought about the power dynamics that governed his entire existence. Hightower's absolute authority over him, but also Thomas's unique access to information that could destroy his master. For the first time in his life, Thomas began to consider the possibility of leverage. He wasn't planning escape. That was nearly impossible for an enslaved person in South Carolina in 1853, particularly one who was as recognizable and valuable as he was. But perhaps there was another way. Perhaps the information he possessed, carefully used, could be transformed from mere knowledge into something more tangible. Security, protection, maybe even eventual freedom. The ideas were dangerous, bordering on suicidal, but they were there, taking shape in his mind as he listened to the sounds of the plantation at night. The next morning, Hightower provided Thomas with everything he needed. Travel papers identifying him as the property of Samuel Hightower and authorized to travel on plantation business, a letter of introduction to the Blackwell law firm, a sealed envelope containing Hightower's formal response to their demands, and a small purse of coins for expenses. Garrett, the overseer, was instructed to escort Thomas to Charleston in the plantation wagon, to see him to the lawyer's office, and to wait while the business was conducted. Hightower was taking no chances that Thomas might attempt to run or to deviate from his assigned task. The journey to Charleston took most of the day. Garrett drove in silence, his weathered face unreadable. He had been given his instructions and would carry them out without question or curiosity. That was the kind of man he was. Charleston in January was cold and grey, the streets busy with commerce despite the chill. The law office of Blackwell & Sons was located near the waterfront in a respectable brick building that housed several professional firms. Garrett waited with the wagon while Thomas climbed the stairs to the second-floor office. The clerk who greeted him was a young white man who looked at Thomas with undisguised suspicion and curiosity. It was unusual, after all, for an enslaved person to arrive at a law office with business to conduct. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Samuel Hightower," Thomas explained, showing the letter of introduction. "I have a response to the correspondence sent to Mr. Hightower regarding the Hayes matter." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "I see. Wait here." He disappeared into an inner office, and Thomas heard low voices in discussion. After a few minutes, an older man emerged, one of the Blackwell partners, Thomas assumed. He was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair, and the kind of face that had spent years negotiating deals and settlements. "You're Hightower's man?" the lawyer asked. "Yes, sir. And you have a message for us?" Thomas handed over the sealed envelope. The lawyer opened it there in the outer office, his eyes scanning the contents. His expression remained professionally neutral, but Thomas thought he detected a flicker of surprise, or perhaps concern. "This is quite firm," the lawyer said finally. "Mr. Hightower is taking a rather aggressive stance." "I'm instructed to clarify Mr. Hightower's position," Thomas said carefully, reciting the speech he had rehearsed. "He maintains that the allegations have no basis in fact, and that any attempt to pursue them publicly will be met with the full force of his legal and financial resources. He wishes to make clear that such a course would be detrimental to all parties involved." The lawyer studied him for a long moment. "You're educated," he observed, "unusual for someone in your position." "Mr. Hightower has found it useful," Thomas replied carefully. "I'm sure he has." The lawyer tapped the letter against his palm thoughtfully. "Tell your master that I'll relay his response to my client. But I should inform you, and you may inform him, that Miss Hayes is not without resources of her own. She has evidence, she has witnesses, and she has a son who bears a remarkable resemblance to the Hightower family. If this matter goes to court, it won't be as easily dismissed as Mr. Hightower seems to believe." Thomas nodded. "I'll convey that to Mr. Hightower, sir." "Good. Is there anything else?" This was the moment. Thomas knew he should simply leave, return to Garrett and the wagon, complete his mission exactly as instructed. But instead, he heard himself say, "I wonder, sir, if it would be possible for me to speak briefly with Miss Hayes herself." The lawyer's eyes narrowed. "Why would you want to do that?" Mr. Hightower indicated that if there was room for reasonable compromise, I should explore those possibilities. Thomas improvised. It was a lie, of course. Hightower had said no such thing. But it was a plausible lie, one that fit the situation. The lawyer considered this. Miss Hayes isn't here, but I could potentially arrange for you to meet with her briefly, if you can wait an hour or so. She lives nearby. I can wait, Thomas said. The hours stretched to nearly 2, but finally a woman arrived at the law office. Catherine Hayes was in her mid-40s, well-dressed but not wealthy, with the kind of face that had once been beautiful and still retained a certain quiet dignity. She was accompanied by a young man who could only be Jonathan. The resemblance to Samuel Hightower was striking. Jonathan had the same strong jaw, the same set to his shoulders, the same color eyes. If anyone compared him to Hightower side by side, there would be no question of paternity. The meeting took place in a small conference room, with the lawyer present but standing slightly apart, allowing Thomas and Catherine Hayes to speak. "You work for Samuel?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, not quite bitterness, but a kind of tired resignation. "Yes, ma'am. I manage his correspondence." "So you've read my letters?" "Yes, ma'am. And what do you think of them?" "Of me? A woman trying to extort money from her former lover." There was a challenge in the question. Thomas chose his words carefully. "I think, ma'am, that you're trying to provide for your son. I understand that." Catherine Hayes studied him for a long moment. "Samuel sent you here to frighten me, didn't he? To make me understand that he'll destroy me if I persist. He sent me to deliver a message." "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you can tell Samuel that I'm not frightened." Her voice was steady. "I've lived with this secret for 17 years. I've raised Jonathan on my own, with minimal help from the man who fathered him. I've asked for nothing, demanded nothing until now. But my son deserves better than what I can provide for him alone. He deserves an education, opportunities, a future, and his father has the means to provide those things." Jonathan stood silently beside his mother, and Thomas saw something in the young man's eyes. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of quiet determination. He was old enough to understand the situation, to know what his mother was fighting for. "Ma'am," Thomas said slowly, "may I speak frankly? Please. Mr. Hightower will not acknowledge Jonathan publicly. He cannot. It would destroy his marriage, his social position, potentially his business relationships. No argument or legal threat will change that fundamental reality." "Then what are you suggesting?" Catherine Hayes asked. "I'm suggesting that perhaps there's a middle ground, an arrangement that provides for Jonathan's future without requiring public acknowledgement. A trust of some kind, perhaps, or a settlement that appears to have nothing to do with paternity. Something that gives Jonathan the opportunities he deserves while protecting Mr. Hightower's reputation." The lawyer who had been listening spoke up. "That's actually not far from what we initially proposed, before Mr. Hightower's aggressive response." Thomas nodded. "I think if the proposal were presented in the right way, there might be room for negotiation. But it would require patience, discretion, and a willingness to accept less than complete victory on both sides." Catherine Hayes looked at her son, then back at Thomas. "You're very well spoken for someone in your position. Samuel chose his confidential secretary well." "Thank you, ma'am." "Why are you helping us?" she asked suddenly. "You work for Samuel. Your loyalty should be to him." It was a fair question, and Thomas didn't have a simple answer. "I'm not sure I'm helping anyone, ma'am. I'm simply trying to prevent a situation that would hurt everyone involved, including Mr. Hightower." That much was true, at least partially. But there was another truth beneath it, one Thomas was only beginning to acknowledge to himself. He was tired of being invisible, of accumulating knowledge he could never use, of watching other people's lives and dramas unfold while his own life remained static, controlled, owned. This situation, dangerous as it was, represented something else. It represented possibility. Thomas left the law office with a promise that he would speak to Hightower about alternative approaches to settlement. Garrett drove him back to the plantation in the same taciturn silence as before, unaware that the meeting had gone far beyond a simple delivery of a message. When Thomas reported to Hightower that evening, he carefully edited his account. He described the lawyer's reception of Hightower's letter, conveyed the warning that Miss Hayes had evidence and witnesses, and suggested that a settlement, carefully structured to avoid any admission of paternity, might be the most practical solution. Hightower listened, his face unreadable. "You spoke only to the lawyer?" he asked. Thomas hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "The lawyer and his client, sir. She arrived while I was there. The lawyer thought it might facilitate understanding if we spoke briefly." "I see." Hightower's eyes were sharp, suspicious. "And what was your impression of Miss Hayes?" "She's determined, sir, but I believe she's also practical. She wants security for her son, not scandal. If that security can be provided without public acknowledgement, I think she would accept such an arrangement." "And you came to this conclusion based on a brief conversation?" "Based on the tone of her letters, the lawyer's comments, and yes, the conversation, sir." Hightower stood and walked to the window again, that same position he had taken during their previous difficult discussion. "You've been useful today, Thomas. More useful than I expected. But I need you to understand something clearly. This matter is extremely delicate. The wrong word to the wrong person could be devastating. Your discretion isn't just requested, it's absolutely required." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Hightower turned to face him. "Because I'm beginning to wonder if you understand too much. If your access to my correspondence has given you ideas, ambitions perhaps." The moment stretched between them, dangerous and charged. Thomas kept his face carefully neutral, his voice steady. "I have no ambitions beyond serving you faithfully, sir, as I have for 12 years. "Good," Hightower said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Good. Then we'll continue as we have been. I'll consider the options for settlement. You'll maintain absolute silence about this entire matter. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, sir." But as Thomas left the office that night, he felt the weight of Hightower's suspicion like a physical presence. The master was beginning to wonder if his perfectly loyal, perfectly discreet secretary might represent a danger, and Hightower was right to wonder. Over the next few weeks, Thomas became the intermediary in a delicate negotiation. Letters flowed back and forth between the plantation and Charleston, between Hightower and the Blackwell firm, and Thomas read every word of every letter on both sides. Slowly, painfully, an agreement began to take shape. Hightower would establish a trust fund, not for Jonathan Hayes specifically, but for certain educational purposes managed by the Blackwell firm. The amount was substantial, enough to cover Jonathan's education at a good school in the north, with additional provisions for his eventual establishment in business or profession. In exchange, Catherine Hayes would sign a legal document stating that she made no claims against Samuel Hightower, would not seek further financial support, and would not publicly suggest any connection between the Hightower and Hayes families. The document was carefully worded to avoid any admission of paternity while still binding both parties to silence. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but that everyone could live with. The lawyers drew up the papers. Hightower reviewed and approved them. A date was set for the signing of the agreement to take place at the Blackwell office in Charleston. Thomas was instructed to attend the signing, to witness the signatures, and ensure that all documents were properly executed. This time he would travel alone. Hightower evidently had decided that Garrett's presence was unnecessary, or perhaps he simply wanted the whole matter concluded as quietly as possible. The morning of the signing, Hightower called Thomas into the office before dawn. "This matter will be concluded today," Hightower said. "After this, I don't want to hear the name Catherine Hayes or Jonathan Hayes ever again. The papers will be signed, filed with the lawyers, and forgotten. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "And Thomas, once this is done, I think it would be wise for us to make some changes to how the office operates. I've been thinking that perhaps you've taken on too much responsibility. Perhaps it would be better to distribute some of those duties among other staff. You could focus on simpler tasks, the kind that don't require you to read quite so much of my correspondence." The message was clear. Hightower no longer trusted him with full access to the correspondence. The master was beginning to see his educated slave as a liability rather than an asset. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "As you think best, sir." "I do," Hightower said. "But let's get through today first. Complete this task satisfactorily, and we'll discuss the new arrangements when you return." Thomas made the journey to Charleston with a sense of foreboding. He carried the signed documents from Hightower, the authorization for the trust fund, all the papers necessary to conclude the agreement. But he also carried the copies he had made of all the correspondence hidden in the lining of his jacket. The signing took place in the conference room of the Blackwell office. Catherine Hayes was there, dressed in her best clothes, looking both relieved and sad. Jonathan sat beside her, solemn and quiet. The Blackwell partners were present, along with a notary to witness the signatures. Thomas handed over Hightower's documents. The lawyers reviewed them, nodded their approval. Catherine Hayes signed her name to the agreement with a hand that trembled slightly. The lawyers signed as witnesses. The notary applied his seal. It was done. "Miss Hayes," one of the lawyers said, "the trust will be administered by our firm according to the terms outlined. Your son will have access to the funds for education and establishment as agreed. You'll receive quarterly reports on the trust's status." "Thank you," Catherine Hayes said quietly. She stood to leave, and as she passed Thomas, she paused. "I don't know what you said to Samuel," she said softly, "but I believe you're responsible for this settlement. Thank you." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond. But Jonathan stopped as well, looking at Thomas with those eyes that were so much like Hightower's. "What's your name?" he asked. "Thomas, sir." "Thank you, Thomas. I understand you work for my—" He paused, correcting himself. "For Mr. Hightower. I hope you're treated fairly there." There was something in the young man's tone, a recognition, perhaps, that Thomas's position was complicated, that his role in all this had been both powerful and powerless. "I manage, sir," Thomas said. After Catherine and Jonathan Hayes left, Thomas collected the executed copies of the agreement for Hightower and prepared to return to the plantation. But as he descended the stairs of the law office, he made a decision. He didn't return to the plantation immediately. Instead, he went to the Charleston courthouse, to the Office of Public Records. It was a risky move. An enslaved man entering a courthouse alone could attract unwanted attention. But Thomas had his papers, his letter of authorization from Hightower, and the confident bearing of someone who belonged. The clerk at the records office looked at him with the same suspicion Thomas had encountered at the law office. But Thomas explained that he was filing documents on behalf of the Hightower plantation. The clerk, bored and indifferent, showed him to the filing room. What Thomas did next was either very clever or very foolish, depending on how one looked at it. He made additional copies of the Hayes settlement agreement, carefully writing them out by hand. He filed one copy in the public records, in the section for trust agreements and estate documents, where it would sit unnoticed among thousands of similar papers unless someone specifically searched for it. It wasn't illegal to file such a document. It was a legitimate legal agreement after all. But neither Hightower nor the Blackwell firm had intended for it to become a matter of public record. The other copies, Thomas kept for himself. Then he returned to the plantation and reported to Hightower that the matter was concluded. The agreements were signed, the trust established, the Hayes family satisfied. It was over. Hightower seemed relieved, but his manner toward Thomas remained cool, distant. True to his word, he began implementing changes to how the office operated. Other slaves were brought in to handle correspondence sorting. Thomas was relegated to simpler filing tasks, physical organization of papers, maintenance of the office. He still read, but he no longer had unfettered access to all of Hightower's business and personal correspondence. The master was limiting his slave's knowledge, reducing his power. For Thomas, this was confirmation that he had been right to prepare for this possibility. The copies he had made, the documents he had carefully hidden, were his insurance policy. Not something to be used lightly or rashly, but something to have, just in case. The months passed. Spring came to the low country, then summer. The plantation operated as it always had. Hightower conducted his business, entertained guests, traveled to Charleston for social and commercial purposes. Thomas performed his reduced duties in the office, reading when he could, but mostly just filing and organizing. It might have continued that way indefinitely, if not for the fire. It started in the middle of a hot July night in one of the storage buildings near the gin house. No one knew how it began. Perhaps a lantern left burning, perhaps a spark from someone's pipe, perhaps spontaneous combustion in the cotton lint that accumulated in such buildings. However it started, it spread quickly. The alarm was raised, and every able body on the plantation was mobilized to fight the fire. Bucket brigades formed, drawing water from the river. Men beat at the flames with wet sacks. Hightower himself was there, directing the effort, his face smoke-stained and desperate. The storage building was lost, but the main gin house was saved. So was the main house, though it had been terrifyingly close to catching. By dawn, the fire was out, leaving behind charred ruins and exhausted people. It was during the chaos of fighting the fire that Thomas noticed something strange. Garrett, the overseer, was missing. Thomas saw him briefly when the alarm first sounded, saw him running toward the fire with the others, but at some point, during the long night, Garrett had disappeared. In the morning, Garrett's body was found in the rubble of the storage building. He had apparently been trapped inside when the roof collapsed. It was a tragic accident, everyone agreed. Garrett had been trying to save equipment or records stored in the building and had been caught by the collapsing structure. But Thomas wondered. Garrett had been a hard man, often cruel, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have entered a burning building unless he had a compelling reason. 2 days after the fire, Hightower called Thomas into the office. The master looked exhausted, aged by the stress of the fire and its aftermath. "Thomas," he said, "I need you to do a complete inventory of the office records. The fire has made me aware of how vulnerable our documents are. I want to know exactly what we have, what's missing, what needs to be recreated." "Yes, sir. Start with the locked drawers and the confidential files. I want a complete accounting." Thomas spent the next week on the inventory. He worked methodically, cataloging every paper, every ledger, every piece of correspondence, and when he reached the locked drawer where the Hayes correspondence had been filed, he found it empty. Every letter from Catherine Hayes, every response from Hightower, every piece of documentation related to the settlement, all of it was gone. Thomas stared at the empty drawer for a long moment, his mind working. Then he went to find Hightower. "Sir," he said, "the Hayes correspondence, it's missing from the confidential files." Hightower looked up from his desk, his face carefully neutral. "Is it?" "Yes, sir. The entire file is gone. Perhaps it was misfiled, or perhaps I moved it to another location for safekeeping. I wouldn't worry about it, Thomas." But Thomas saw the truth in his master's eyes. The papers hadn't been misfiled. They had been deliberately removed, and Thomas was suddenly certain that Garrett hadn't died in a tragic accident. He had been in that building because he'd been ordered to be there, perhaps to destroy records, perhaps to retrieve something. And the fire had been no accident either. Hightower had decided to erase all evidence of the Hayes affair, and he had been willing to sacrifice Garrett to do it. Thomas felt a chill run through him, but he kept his voice steady. "Of course, sir. I'll continue the inventory." "You do that," Hightower said, and turned back to his work. That night, Thomas lay awake, thinking about his hidden copies of the correspondence, about the documents he had filed in the Charleston courthouse. He had thought of them as insurance, as leverage. Now he realized they were something else. They were evidence of a crime. If Hightower had murdered Garrett to cover up the Hayes affair, then Thomas possessed the proof of what the master had been so desperate to hide. The letters showed the timeline, the motive, the master's growing desperation as Catherine Hayes persisted in her demands. But what could Thomas do with that knowledge? He was an enslaved man. He had no legal standing, no right to testify in court against a white man, no way to bring charges or seek justice. The information that might have been powerful in free hands was nearly worthless in his. Nearly, but not quite, because there were people who would be very interested in such information. Catherine Hayes, for instance, the Blackwell law firm. Perhaps even Martha Hightower, the wife who had been betrayed. Information might not be power in the direct sense, but it could be currency in the right circumstances. Thomas began to formulate a plan. It was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but he was beginning to realize that his position was already precarious. Hightower no longer trusted him, no longer valued him as he once had. And if the master was capable of murdering Garrett to protect his secrets, what would he do to the slave who actually knew those secrets? In September, Thomas found his opportunity. Hightower was traveling to Richmond for business, a trip that would keep him away for at least a week. Before leaving, he gave Thomas instructions for routine matters to be handled in his absence. "I'll be staying with my sister, Mrs. Fairmont," Hightower said. "If anything urgent arises, you can send correspondence there. Otherwise, maintain the regular operations until I return." "Yes, sir." The day after Hightower left, Thomas went to Garrett's widow, a worn woman who had lived in a small house at the edge of the plantation. She had been given a small pension after Garrett's death, enough to survive but not much more. "Mrs. Garrett," Thomas said, "I need to ask you something about your husband, about the night of the fire." She looked at him with tired, suspicious eyes. "What about it? Did he say anything to you that evening? Anything about what he was planning to do? Why do you want to know?" Thomas hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because I don't think his death was an accident. I think he was doing something for Mr. Hightower, something dangerous, and the fire was part of it." Mrs. Garrett stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "He said Mr. Hightower had asked him to take care of something that night. Some papers that needed to be gotten rid of. He was supposed to burn them in the storage building, make it look like they were lost in an accident with a lamp. But something went wrong. The fire spread too fast and he couldn't get out." "Did he say what papers?" "No, just that they were important, that Mr. Hightower didn't want anyone to find them." Her voice broke. "My husband died protecting that man's secrets, and what did I get for it? A pittance of a pension and this shack to live in." "Would you be willing to tell this to someone else?" Thomas asked. "Someone who might be able to do something about it? Who would listen to me? Or to you? We're nothing. Hightower owns this plantation, owns everyone on it. Who's going to take our word over his?" "Maybe no one," Thomas admitted, "but maybe it's worth trying." He left Mrs. Garrett to think about it and made his way back to the office. There, he carefully retrieved his hidden copies of the Hayes correspondence from their hiding place in the old ledger. He also drafted a letter addressed to the Blackwell law firm in Charleston, explaining what he believed had happened to Garrett and why. It was a letter that could get him killed if it was intercepted. But it was also his only chance to use what he knew before Hightower decided to eliminate the risk Thomas represented. He had one of the house servants, a woman named Mary who sometimes traveled to Charleston to purchase supplies, deliver the letter for him, telling her only that it was urgent business correspondence that needed to reach the law office immediately. Then he waited. The response came faster than he expected. 3 days after Mary delivered the letter, a carriage arrived at the plantation. It contained not lawyers, but a county magistrate and 2 deputies. They asked to speak with Thomas. The interview took place in the plantation office, the very room where Thomas had spent so many years reading Hightower's correspondence. The magistrate was a heavy-set man with shrewd eyes, and he listened carefully as Thomas explained what he knew. "These are serious allegations," the magistrate said when Thomas finished. "You're accusing Mr. Hightower of murder. Based on what?" "The word of Garrett's widow, some missing correspondence, the fact that papers were destroyed in a fire." "Based on the pattern, sir," Thomas said carefully. "The Hayes affair, the increasing pressure, the sudden fire that conveniently destroyed the evidence, and Garrett's death. It's all connected. And you have proof of this." Thomas handed over the copies of the correspondence. The magistrate read through them slowly, his expression growing more serious. "Where did you get these?" "I made copies, sir. Part of my duties was to maintain records. I thought it wise to keep duplicates of important correspondence. And Mr. Hightower knew you were keeping these copies? No, sir. The magistrate studied him. You're putting yourself in a very dangerous position. You understand that? Whether or not we can prove anything against Hightower, you've admitted to secretly copying your master's private correspondence. That's a violation of trust at the very least. I understand, sir. Why are you doing this? What do you hope to gain? It was the same question Catherine Hayes had asked him months earlier. Thomas had a better answer now. I want to live, sir. I believe that Mr. Hightower sees me as a liability, someone who knows too much. If he was willing to kill Garrett to protect his secrets, he'll eventually decide to eliminate me as well. This is my attempt to protect myself by making those secrets public. If they're already known, there's no point in silencing me. The magistrate nodded slowly. That's clever. Dangerous, but clever. He stood. I'll need to investigate further. Talk to Mrs. Garrett, examine the site of the fire, speak with others who were there that night. In the meantime, you should know that you've set something in motion that can't be stopped. Even if nothing comes of the murder allegations, Hightower will know that you've betrayed him. He'll know what you've done. I know, sir. Then may God help you, the magistrate said. The investigation stretched over the next 2 weeks. Thomas continued his duties in the office, but the atmosphere on the plantation had changed. Word had spread about the magistrate's visit, about the questions being asked. No one knew the full details, but everyone sensed that something significant was happening. Hightower returned from Richmond to find his plantation under scrutiny. When he learned what Thomas had done, his rage was cold and controlled but absolute. You've destroyed everything, he said, facing Thomas in the office. Everything I built, everything I protected. For what? Your freedom? Do you think the magistrate cares about you? You're a slave, Thomas. Your testimony means nothing. You've sacrificed everything, including your own life, for nothing. Maybe, Thomas said. But at least people know now. Miss Hayes knows. Your wife knows. The whole county knows that you had a son you refused to acknowledge, that you tried to hide it, that a man died because of your secrets. Even if they can't prove murder, they know. Hightower's face was pale, his hands trembling with suppressed fury. Get out of this office. You're relieved of all duties. You'll be sold south by the end of the month. Yes, sir, Thomas said, and left. Being sold south was one of the most feared threats in the enslaved community. It meant being sold to the brutal labor camps of the Deep South, to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, or the cotton fields of Mississippi, where life expectancy was measured in years, and conditions were far harsher than in the coastal regions. It was a death sentence just slower than a bullet, but Thomas had one more card to play. The documents he had filed at the Charleston courthouse had been more than just insurance. They were a public record now, accessible to anyone who knew to look for them, and he had made sure that the right people knew. Catherine Hayes, for one. She had been horrified to learn about Garrett's death and the circumstances surrounding it. She had also been furious to discover that Hightower had tried to destroy all evidence of the settlement agreement, potentially leaving Jonathan without the protection they had negotiated. She went to the newspapers. The scandal that erupted in Charleston society was everything Hightower had feared and worse. The papers didn't explicitly accuse him of murder. That would have been libel. But they reported on the mysterious death of an overseer, on allegations of destroyed evidence, on the existence of a secret son, and a settlement agreement. They noted that a slave with unusual education had brought the matter to light, that a magistrate was investigating. Charleston's high society loved nothing more than a scandal involving one of their own, and the Hightower affair had everything: secret children, possible murder, a betrayal by a trusted servant. Martha Hightower, the wife, filed for separation. The banks that had extended credit to Hightower's operations began calling in their loans. Business partners quietly severed their connections. Within a month, the social and financial edifice that Samuel Hightower had built began to crumble. And in the midst of all this, Thomas found himself in an unexpected position. The magistrate's investigation couldn't prove murder. The evidence was too circumstantial, and Thomas's testimony, as an enslaved person, couldn't be used in court against a white man. But the investigation had made Thomas visible in a way that made him valuable. The newspapers called him the educated slave who exposed the Hightower secrets. Abolitionists in the North got wind of the story and began using it as propaganda. See how even the most privileged enslaved person was ultimately powerless, how even those granted education and relatively good treatment were still property, still vulnerable. Several Northern abolition societies approached the Blackwell law firm with an offer. They would purchase Thomas's freedom and provide him with safe passage to the North, where he could tell his story publicly. Hightower, desperate for cash as his empire collapsed and eager to be rid of the slave who had destroyed him, agreed to the sale. In November of 1853, Thomas walked out of the Hightower plantation as a free man. He carried with him nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge he had accumulated over 12 years of reading other people's mail. The story could have ended there, a triumph of sorts. A slave who used forbidden literacy and carefully gathered information to secure his freedom, to bring down a cruel master, to expose injustice. But the reality was more complicated. Thomas traveled north, first to Philadelphia and then to Boston. The abolition societies that had purchased his freedom wanted him to speak at public meetings, to write his memoirs, to become a voice for the cause. And Thomas tried. He spoke at several meetings, told his story, described his years in the office reading correspondence, explained how he had gathered evidence of Hightower's affair and cover-up. But he found that Northern audiences wanted a different kind of story. They wanted tales of brutal physical abuse, of families torn apart, of escape and heroic flight to freedom. His story of relative privilege, of education, of manipulation and information rather than physical resistance didn't fit the narrative they expected. Moreover, Thomas discovered something uncomfortable about his own actions. Yes, he had exposed Hightower's secrets and secured his own freedom. But in doing so, he had also devastated Catherine Hayes and her son. The public scandal had ruined them socially. Catherine Hayes was forced to leave Charleston, ostracized by the community. Jonathan's hopes for education and establishment were complicated by being publicly known as an illegitimate child. Thomas had used their story as leverage for his own freedom, and they had paid a price for that. He tried to make contact with Catherine Hayes to apologize, to explain, but she refused to see him. He received a single letter from her, brief and cold. You did what you needed to do to survive. I understand that. But please don't expect gratitude or forgiveness. You saved yourself at the expense of my son's future. That was your choice, and we all must live with it. As for Hightower, the former planter never recovered from the scandal. He sold the plantation at a loss, moved to a smaller property in the western part of the state, and died of a stroke 2 years later. His wife never reconciled with him. Thomas lived the rest of his life in Boston, working as a clerk and eventually as a teacher in a school for black children. He never wrote his memoirs, despite continued requests from abolitionists. He kept the copies of the Hightower correspondence hidden away, never showing them to anyone. When he was older, a student once asked him if he regretted his actions, if he would do things differently given the chance. Thomas thought about it for a long time before answering. I read a sentence, he finally said, that changed my life. That gave me the opportunity to become free. But freedom came at a cost, not just to me, but to others who were caught up in the secrets I revealed. Was it worth it? I don't know. I'm here, I'm free, I'm alive. But I'm not sure I can call it justice. It's more like survival. And survival is rarely clean or simple. He paused, then added, literacy is a powerful thing. Knowledge is a powerful thing. But power doesn't automatically translate into righteousness. That's something I learned too late. The story of the only slave allowed to read the master's letters is not a simple tale of triumph or tragedy. It's a story about the complicated nature of power and knowledge, about the moral ambiguities of survival under oppression, about the unintended consequences of revealing secrets. One sentence changed everything. But whether that change was for better or worse depends on who you ask and what price they paid for the truth. Thomas died in 1889 at the age of 58. Among his personal effects was a locked box containing copies of letters written more than 35 years earlier. His students wondered why he had kept them, what significance they held, but Thomas had never explained, and the letters, like so many secrets, went with him to the grave.